Greeting and introduction to the mysterious disappearance. Hello there, and thank you for joining me today as I unravel a story that shook the quiet foundations of an entire American community and, for a time, captured the nation's attention. Picture this: crisp winter air, city streets aglow with holiday lights, and families across America coming together to celebrate Christmas. Spirits are high, neighborhoods buzz with activity, and a sense of peace gently settles over the land. But for one family and a whole town in Massachusetts, the 2010 holiday season would never be the same again. Let me introduce you to a chilling mystery: the unexplained disappearance of a bright, ambitious 25-year-old woman named Joanna Z. Unlike the cases you might read in crime novels or see on TV dramas, this was hauntingly real, and the press, as well as true crime followers nationwide, found themselves swept up in every shocking twist. Joanna, with deep roots in her Massachusetts hometown, embodied the American dream. A passionate landscape architect and promising graduate, she was admired for her warmth, ambition, and energy. Yet, despite the seemingly safe setting of her daily life, the familiar coffee shops, the welcoming neighbors, the well-lit streets of her Beacon Hill neighborhood, danger lurked closer than anyone could have imagined. As the Christmas countdown ticked by, Joanna's sudden and total disappearance would shatter the illusion that tragedy can't strike in the heart of an ordinary American city. Her story would ignite not only a massive police investigation but also a media storm so intense that it sent shockwaves through the journalistic world. Before long, questions about safety, trust, and the boundaries of privacy would echo across TV stations and online forums. All the while, her family's desperation and the community's unease grew with each passing hour. What happened to Joanna Z? How could a cheerful young woman simply vanish, leaving behind everything: her phone, her wallet, her beloved cat, without a trace on the eve of Christmas? Join me as I recount with painstaking detail the lives touched and forever changed by one inexplicable night in Boston. From the first anxious phone calls to the relentless media frenzy and the stunning revelations that would ultimately emerge, this is the beginning of Joanna Z's story, and the lasting mark it would leave on American society. Main character, Joanna Z. Let me tell you about Joanna Z. Not simply the name behind startling headlines, but a real person whose presence lit up every room she entered. Joanna Z was born in April 1985 in the historic town of Salem, Massachusetts. She grew up in a charming white frame house on a quiet, tree-lined street, the youngest daughter of Mark and Eleanor Zimmerman. Her father was a local architect and her mother a high school art teacher. Together, they fostered a creative and nurturing environment that shaped Joanna's earliest ambitions. From a young age, Joanna was the definition of precocious, curious, inquisitive, and bursting with energy. She had a mop of chestnut hair, lively green eyes, and a laugh so infectious that it often drew neighbors over for impromptu chats on the porch. She excelled academically, frequently skipping ahead in reading and showing talent in visual arts. But Joanna's natural warmth extended beyond books and brushes. She was the kind of child who made friends wherever she went, whether teaming up for youth soccer or organizing charity bake sales at her elementary school. Childhood for Joanna was a patchwork of adventures, riding her bike with her older brother Patrick, exploring the woods behind their house, and spending summers in Cape Cod collecting seashells. Teachers described Joanna as relentlessly positive, intensely focused, and impossibly thoughtful. She always included the quietest kids in group activities, and was known for her handwritten thank you notes to teachers and neighbors alike. At Salem High School, as both an honor student and volunteer, she found her passion for shaping spaces, not just artistically, but in a way that brought people together. Art club, student government, and the environmental committee all benefited from Joanna's involvement. She painted murals for the school, revamped the community garden, and coordinated recycling drives. Her creativity was balanced by a deep empathy that made her a natural mediator and confidant for friends dealing with family problems or heartbreak. Life at home reflected this empathy and warmth. Joanna and her parents often hosted exchange students, believing in the richness of cross-cultural friendships. Many holiday dinners included an eclectic mix of guests, sometimes strangers soon to become honorary family members. Her mother Eleanor taught her to value compassion above all, and her father inspired her to look for beauty in function, planting the first seeds of Joanna's affection for landscape design. By her late teens, Joanna had set her sights on a future in landscape architecture, a calling she saw as the perfect synergy of her love for art, nature, and human connection. With impressive grades and glowing recommendations, she earned a coveted place at Crit College, one of New England's most selective liberal arts colleges. There she flourished, carving out a unique academic path that combined environmental science, landscape architecture, and public art. Professors were wowed not just by her talent but also by her determination to make a lasting difference. She secured internships, led student-led urban greening projects, and still found time to teach art to children at a local community center. Joanna was a person of layers, playful yet disciplined, outgoing yet introspective, deeply attentive to her friends but fiercely independent in pursuing her ambitions. Her defining traits, her sense of fairness, her resilience, her infectious optimism, shaped the lives she touched and the community she called home. As she graduated college and moved on to her graduate studies at Clark University, her sense of purpose only sharpened. Joanna's journey from Salem to the bustling heart of Boston was not just a geographic shift, but a testament to her unwavering vision to transform the world, one thoughtfully designed green space at a time. This is the woman whose story upended a city and left us all searching for answers long after that fateful December night. Joanna's passion and career. Joanna Z was the embodiment of purposeful ambition. From the moment she enrolled at Crit College, her path toward landscape architecture was marked by single-minded passion and vision. She saw the world around her not just as it was, but for what it could become, a patchwork of thriving green spaces where communities could connect and nature would be woven seamlessly into urban life. Upon graduating in 2008 at the age of 23, Joanna wasted no time stepping into the professional landscape. She moved to the city of Worcester, Massachusetts, a vibrant, old-growth city with enormous potential for reinvention. There, she secured her first position as a junior landscape architect at Greenline Design Associates, an innovative firm known for revitalizing neglected urban spaces. Eager and resourceful, Joanna didn't simply do what was asked. She reimagined community parks, spearheaded proposals for environmentally friendly rooftops, and brought an infectious energy to everyday meetings. The trust she quickly earned from colleagues was both professional and deeply personal. Her warmth fostered collaboration, mentorship, and friendship in an often competitive environment. It was here that Joanna met Greg Ron, a fellow landscape architect just 2 years her senior. What began as lunchtime brainstorming sessions over conceptual sketches soon blossomed into a bond fueled by mutual respect and genuine camaraderie. Their shared love for design, environmental stewardship, and ambitious ideas became the foundation for not only innovative work, but a romantic relationship that would come to define this chapter of Joanna's life. The rapid growth of the company led to its relocation in late 2009, moving headquarters from Worcester to the bustling heart of Boston, one of America's most historic and dynamic cities. The decision to relocate might have deterred others, but for Joanna and Greg, it was an exhilarating leap. Together, they left the familiarity of Worcester for Boston's downtown buzz, renting a modest apartment and throwing themselves into both their work and the rhythms of a new city. Their home quickly became a sanctuary, filled with hand-picked furniture, thriving succulents, and a beloved tabby cat named Pixel. Friends recall their lively dinner parties and the way Joanna's laughter resonated down the hallway. Not one to settle, Joanna propelled herself forward. After gaining invaluable experience, she made another bold move. To one of Boston's top 3 landscape architecture firms, Urban Vision Studio, renowned for demanding standards and cutting-edge projects. Each new role was a deliberate step. Joanna wanted to test her skills, learn from the best, and leave an imprint in a field still evolving toward true environmentalism. With each design review or site visit, she brought a balance of tenacity and creativity, gaining the trust of industry veterans and becoming a sought-after collaborator on major urban renewal initiatives. By October 2010, Joanna and Greg decided to upgrade their living situation, moving into a sleek, newly renovated apartment in Beacon Hill, a prestigious enclave defined by its historic architecture and tree-shaded streets. Here they invested in their shared future, dreaming up possibilities for their home and professional lives. Joanna was especially eager to leave her mark on Boston's landscape, volunteering for municipal working groups and mentoring local students interested in sustainable design. She truly loved her work. It was both her calling and her canvas for improving the world one thriving garden or transformed street at a time. But despite the promise and optimism filling her days, fate had plans no one could foresee. The skills Joanna honed, her vision, resilience, and spirit, remain her enduring legacy, offering a powerful reminder of the beauty of pursuing your passions, even in the face of the unknown. Budding love and the big move to the city. There's something exhilarating and maybe even a little intimidating about starting over in a brand new city, especially when you're doing it for both love and career. For Joanna Z, the intersection of personal growth and professional opportunities became the backdrop for one of the most pivotal chapters in her young life. It all began at Green Line Design Associates, a vibrant firm in Worcester, Massachusetts, where Joanna's natural charm and tireless dedication quickly made her a favorite among colleagues. But it was one colleague in particular, Greg Ron, who would shape her journey in ways neither of them could have predicted. Greg, a landscape architect just 2 years her senior, shared Joanna's unwavering passion for urban green spaces. Their bond formed slowly at first, collaborative brainstorming over ambitious project proposals, long walks through city parks discussing the future of public spaces, and coffee breaks where professional banter began to slip into conversations about life, family, and personal ambitions. Neither Joanna nor Greg rushed things. Both were equally invested in supporting each other's ideas and pushing the boundaries of their shared field. But, as seasons changed, their friendship softened into something much deeper, a partnership grounded in mutual respect, laughter, and a growing affection that became evident to everyone around them. By the fall of 2009, fate threw them another curveball. Green Line Design announced it would relocate headquarters from Worcester to downtown Boston, one of America's most exciting urban centers brimming with culture, history, and professional promise. For many employees, the prospect of leaving behind the familiar comforts of Worcester for Boston's fast-paced rhythm was daunting, and plenty chose to resign and stay behind. Joanna and Greg, however, saw it differently. The chance to work in Boston, a city celebrated for its innovation and commitment to green urban development, felt like the ultimate professional playground. Together, they decided to embrace the adventure, packing up their lives and moving roughly 40 miles east to a city entirely unfamiliar to both of them. Their arrival in Boston marked the start of a new chapter that was both nerve-wracking and electrifying. The couple settled into a modest one-bedroom apartment in downtown, a space small in size but bursting with enthusiasm and hope. Decorating their new home was an act of collaborative creativity, walls adorned with Greg's black and white cityscape photos, Joanna's collection of vintage botanical prints, and the ever-growing jungle of houseplants that the two tended with loving care. Evenings were spent exploring the city's hidden gardens, trendy bistros, and local markets, each excursion deepening their bond and sense of partnership. Social circles grew fast, too. Colleagues became friends, neighbors invited them to rooftop barbecues and weekend art fairs, and slowly, the big city began to feel more like home. It wasn't just a move for a job or a relationship, it was a leap into adulthood with all its uncertainties, excitement, and promise. Joanna found herself invigorated by the sheer scale and ambition of Boston, while Greg marveled at how his and Joanna's ambitions dovetailed so naturally both in and out of the workplace. Looking back, it's clear that the move to Boston wasn't just a change of address, it was the blossoming of a partnership, grounded in ambition, love, and the conviction that together, they could thrive anywhere. New life and career changes. Making the leap to a new life in the bustling heart of Boston wasn't just about romance or following a career path for Joanna. It marked a true turning point in her journey as a young woman, a professional, and perhaps most profoundly, as a seeker of identity among unfamiliar city lights. Settling into Beacon Hill, Joanna couldn't help but marvel at how dramatically her surroundings had changed. Ornate brownstones and winding cobblestone streets replaced the familiar tranquility of her childhood neighborhood, and the endless hum of the city infused her daily routine with both exhilaration and challenge. Work, of course, was front and center in this phase of Joanna's life. After gaining solid experience and recognition at her first firm, the ambitious landscape architect found herself yearning for projects even larger in scale, places where her voice wouldn't just add to the conversation, but might actually shape its entire direction. That restlessness, a blend of grit and a refusal to settle, compelled her to research and ultimately secure a position at Urban Vision Studio, a top-tier company renowned for their innovative, high-profile urban renewal projects. Right away, Joanna was catapulted into a whirlwind of meetings, site visits, and design reviews, more challenging than anything she'd encountered before. Yet the very intensity of this environment was what thrilled her. Every sketch she produced, every late-night team whiteboard session, and every client pitch refined her talents and showed her new facets of herself. Balancing personal and professional transformation wasn't easy. There were evenings when Joanna returned home exhausted, covered in city dust, her mind swirling with unresolved design dilemmas. Greg's constant quiet support became her anchor. Sometimes all it took was their ritual of sharing takeout on the windowsill or tending to the ever-resilient plants in their tiny apartment to ease her mind. And through it all, Joanna began to uncover subtle truths about thriving in a city that moved at dizzying speed. The value of humility when learning from senior partners, the necessity of diplomatic honesty in feedback sessions, and the unyielding importance of maintaining your own voice amidst the noise. What set Joanna apart at Urban Visions wasn't just her technical knowledge, it was the way she could bring disparate opinions together, channel anxieties into innovation, and inspire teams to take creative risks. Her approach to each park or streetscape was profoundly people-focused. She believed every small change to a public space had a ripple effect on residents' daily lives. Whether she was battling for more green zones in a neglected block or advocating rooftop gardens atop decades-old buildings, her passion made colleagues rally behind her causes. Outside the office, adjusting to Boston meant embracing its quirks, a patchwork of tight communities, historic pride, and unforgiving winters. Joanna threw herself into local workshops, made friends at farmers markets, found favorite haunts in old bookstores and jazz clubs, and slowly built a new sense of belonging. The isolation that sometimes crept in, the pangs of homesickness and self-doubt, only strengthened her determination to root herself in her new reality, to take risks, and, above all, to keep growing. And though the city never quite lost its edge, Joanna's resilience and creative spark helped her forge meaning and joy even on the coldest, hardest days. This chapter, for her, was never just a stepping stone, it was a crucible where she transformed fleeting dreams into a rich and complex reality, one project and one relationship at a time. Moving to the luxury apartment complex and an unexpected disaster. Moving into the upscale apartment in Beacon Hill was, for Joanna and Greg, a symbol of achievement and the beginning of a thrilling new chapter. They had spent countless evenings scouting for the perfect place, one that would reflect their shared aesthetic sensibilities and offer both security and comfort in the bustling heart of Boston. Beacon Hill, with its historic brick sidewalks, stately street lamps, and elegant brownstones, promised the blend of tradition and modernity that Joanna so cherished. The apartment itself was a ground-floor unit, newly renovated with tall windows, hardwood floors, and just enough space for Joanna's ever-growing collection of potted plants. The process of moving in felt almost ceremonial. Joanna excitedly mapped out where to place each piece of furniture. She insisted on arranging the living room to maximize sunlight for her succulents and ferns, and Greg hung their favorite art prints with surgical precision. Slowly their personalities infused every corner. The cozy reading nook adorned with Joanna's dog-eared novels, the tiny balcony set up with a bistro table for morning coffee, and the kitchen that soon filled with the aroma of Greg's home-cooked meals. Each evening they'd unwind on the soft blue couch, exchanging stories about their hectic days and imagining future celebrations in this space that finally felt truly theirs. They quickly settled into the rhythm of Beacon Hill, Joanna making friends with the barista at the local cafe, Greg chatting with neighbors during evening walks with Pixel the cat. The building was quiet, its residents a mix of young professionals, retirees, and visiting academics, all respectful and tight-knit, yet largely keeping to themselves. For Joanna, the new apartment was a peaceful haven amid her demanding professional life. She could retreat from the noise and recharge in a space she wholeheartedly adored. That sense of security proved deceptive. Just weeks after they had truly settled, December's chill swept through Boston. The holiday season brought twinkling lights and festive crowds, but it also cast long shadows across the city as night arrived early and left late. Joanna and Greg were busy preparing for their first Christmas together in the new apartment, excitedly making lists for their holiday dinner and discussing whose families would visit first. But in mid-December, fate took a horrible turn. One day, dull and unremarkable at first glance, would become etched permanently in the memories of everyone who knew them. Greg, needing to visit his family in a neighboring state, left Joanna alone for a weekend, a quiet Friday evening at home for her, while he looked forward to returning Sunday night. They had done this before, neither thought twice about the brief separation. The calamity struck suddenly, and without warning. Joanna, safe and full of plans for the weekend, could not have foreseen that their carefully built sanctuary would become the setting for a devastating crime. The beautiful apartment, once a symbol of new beginnings, would overnight transform into the epicenter of a tragedy that sent shock waves through their lives and the entire community. Walls that had sheltered secrets and laughter would soon hold only silence, and the very sense of safety that Beacon Hill promised was irreparably shattered. The fateful night, December 17, 2010. December had always carried an air of unspoken magic for Joanna, but that Friday, the 17th, began unassumingly, as so many pivotal days do. The city was veiled in a brittle winter chill, with snow clinging stubbornly to Beacon Hill's historic brick sidewalks. Christmas was near, festive lights glimmered from windows, strangers exchanged polite smiles in the street, and muffled carols played in distant shops. For Joanna, the day started as an extension of her usual routine, brimming with a sense of purpose and a dash of seasonal excitement. She awoke before dawn, pulling on her softest wool sweater, a favorite in her winter wardrobe, and lingered at the window for a moment, watching flakes drift lazily onto the bustling neighborhood below. As usual, Greg was already up, packing for his trip. Their parting conversation was easy, almost playful. Greg invited Joanna to spend the weekend with his family in Connecticut. She declined with gentle assurance, explaining she wanted a quiet weekend to catch up on work and finish her Christmas cards. Greg, understanding as ever, squeezed her hand and promised to call that night. There was nothing remotely ominous, just the fluid, trusted cadence of a couple comfortable in the rhythms of shared life. After breakfast, Joanna left for the office, bundled tightly against the cold, her breath puffing white in the frosty air. By all accounts, the workday was unremarkable. Meetings, a few design tweaks on her current project, quick hellos to colleagues bursting out in holiday cheer as they wrapped up for the year. There was neither tension nor hint of the tragedy that would soon unfold. Joanna was focused, present, and already making a mental checklist of what she'd tackle once back home. That afternoon, her team celebrated with hot cocoa in the break room, exchanging Secret Santa gifts and laughing over the year's odd misadventures. Joanna received a lovely sketchbook, a thoughtful nod to her love of art. She left the office as daylight waned, the sun bleeding gold and tangerine over Boston's skyline. On the walk home, Joanna's phone buzzed with a message from her colleague Sarah, who invited her to join a small after-work gathering at a cozy local bar. Never one to shy from a friendly invitation, especially with Greg away, Joanna accepted, thinking it might be a nice way to ease into her solo evening. At the bar, laughter flowed as locals sipped cider and swapped plans for the coming holidays. Joanna, always the heart of a conversation, told a funny story about her childhood, and listened with genuine interest to others. She didn't linger long. By just after 8, waving cheerful goodbyes, she slipped into the wintry streets and began the familiar walk home. Before heading back to the apartment, she stopped by the corner store, one of those neighborhood staples where the cashier knew her by name. She bought a frozen pizza and a couple bottles of spiced cider, making casual small talk about weekend snow forecasts. Her mood was light. She hummed softly as she strolled the final blocks, her wool scarf pulled tight, cheeks flushed by the chill, and perhaps the lingering warmth of camaraderie. Just before 9 o'clock, Joanna was seen on the security camera entering her building. She exchanged a few pleasantries with a neighbor who was out walking their dog, nodded to the elderly woman on the third floor who always brought cookies at Christmas, then vanished from view as she reached her ground-floor apartment. The digital clock in her entryway would have read 8:53 p.m. as she unlocked the door and slipped off her boots, comforted by the familiar scent of home and the expectant meows of Pixel, her cat. Inside, Joanna settled into her nightly routine. She fed Pixel, put away groceries, and started to preheat the oven. Christmas cards were stacked on the coffee table, half addressed, glittery with snowflake stickers. The TV flickered with the muted glow of an old holiday movie. There were no signs of unease. Greg texted, a quick check-in to say he'd arrived safely. Her response was immediate, filled with affection and emojis, promising to call before bed. Joanna sent one last message to her mother, sharing a picture of the tree she and Greg had decorated the previous week, complete with the old family angel on top. Sometime after 9, she changed into her comfortably faded pajamas and poured herself a glass of cider. It was likely around 9:20 p.m. when Joanna went to open the oven, and realized she'd forgotten to take the pizza out of the box. She laughed at herself, moving with the casual ease of someone alone in a space that feels wholly safe. The city hummed faintly outside, but inside there was only peace, a brief phone call with her father, another round of Christmas card writing, the quiet padding of Pixel along the hardwood floors. Then, the timeline becomes blurry, painfully so. Sometime between 9:30 and 10 p.m., Joanna disappeared from every thread of digital and physical connection. There were no more texts, no outgoing calls. Police would later find her personal effects, Phone, wallet, overcoat sitting untouched by the apartment door as if she had only stepped out briefly but never returned. Pixel too was gone. There were no screams, no frantic disturbances that reached the well-insulated walls. A neighbor, who returned home at 10:15 p.m., remembered hearing faint music and the whir of the oven fan when she passed by, but nothing else. The night closed quietly around the Beacon Hill building, wrapping itself in stillness as snow continued to fall gently. When Greg returned late Sunday night, he was first hit by the odd static silence of the apartment. The discarded pizza box had not moved, and the cider bottle sat, still half full, on the counter. What struck him most was Pixel's absence. Joanna never left without ensuring the cat was cared for. It was in these small, profoundly ordinary details that the magnitude of her disappearance began to dawn. Friends and family would later reconstruct the timeline over and over, clinging to signals and signposts in those last hours, the cheerful farewells at the bar, the receipt from the corner store, the final texts, the evidence of an evening cut shockingly, silently short. For a long while, hope lingered. Maybe Joanna had gone for a late walk, maybe something minor had held her up. But as night deepened, and all the familiar rhythms of her life remained undisturbed, fear began to take root. Something terrible, and still unseen, had shattered the gentle pattern of her world. The story of that night would be pored over by investigators, told and retold on newscasts, obsessed over in internet forums. But within the walls of her Beacon Hill apartment, the reality was intimate, personal, and utterly heartbreaking. Joanna, the vibrant young woman who loved her city and her life, had vanished into the darkness, leaving only unanswered questions and deep, unrelenting silence behind. Shocking discovery, and the initial investigation. Greg returned late on a cold Sunday night, impatiently fumbling with his keys, looking forward to the warmth of his Beacon Hill apartment and Joanna's familiar embrace. The moment he stepped into the entryway, the atmosphere felt wrong. The lights in the living room glowed softly, too softly, as if they had been purposely left on for comfort, but the apartment was silent, even eerie. Joanna's boots were neatly lined up by the door, and her overcoat was on its peg, as if she'd never left the house. The only thing missing from the usual welcoming tableau was Joanna herself, and Pixel, their cat. At first, Greg tried to convince himself everything was fine. Maybe Joanna was taking a late-night stroll, or perhaps she had stepped out to visit a neighbor. But as he moved through the surprisingly tidy space, the knots in his stomach tightened. Her phone was sitting on the coffee table, screen dark, a red flag since Joanna never left home without it. Her wallet and house keys were next to it, and a half-finished mug of spiced cider stood on the counter beside a cooling oven. The discarded pizza box was on the kitchen counter, but its contents had disappeared. There wasn't a single sign that suggested she had planned or needed to leave for any substantial amount of time. By midnight, anxiety outweighed reason. Greg dialed Joanna's parents, Eleanor and Mark, his voice shaking as he detailed the strange, empty evening. Within the hour, calls flew between family members, friends, and finally the Boston Police Department. Officers arrived quickly, combing meticulously through the apartment while the world outside stayed muffled in falling snow. The initial police sweep was both clinical and gentle, as if they were mindful not just of possible evidence, but also of Joanna's presence still lingering in every object. They cataloged what was left behind: Joanna's phone, her purse with all of her cards and cash, her winter gear, and evidence of an abruptly interrupted evening. Officers questioned Greg on the timeline, where he'd been, who Joanna might have seen, whether anything in her routine had seemed out of the ordinary. Greg told them everything he could remember. Joanna had been writing holiday cards. She'd chatted with him by text. She had sent a sweet selfie to her mom, and she had picked up groceries that same evening. Nothing seemed to suggest any willingness or intent to disappear. Both parents arrived in the early hours, visibly shattered. The three scoured every corner of the apartment for clues, a forgotten note, a message in a diary, any sign Joanna might have left to explain her sudden absence. Instead, they found only further confirmation that her departure was completely unintentional. Her beloved sketchbook was open on the sofa with a fresh drawing half-finished. Her laptop, still on, displayed an email draft suggesting she'd intended to respond to a friend later that night. Her cat's food and water dishes were full, yet Pixel was nowhere to be found. As dawn began to creep through frosted windows, the tone of the investigation shifted. A missing person report was officially filed, and Beacon Hill began to buzz with a tense, frightened energy. For neighbors, the sight of flashing lights and officers moving quietly in and out of the building was both surreal and deeply unsettling. Several gathered in the hall at a respectful distance, murmuring their confusion and concern. Boston detectives made their way from door to door, interviewing every resident. An elderly woman in apartment 3B remembered seeing Joanna at the front entrance around 8:50 p.m. Friday night. A young couple from across the street recalled a cheerful wave as Joanna returned from the store with groceries, but past that, the trail went cold. The search widened rapidly. Greg worked closely with police and volunteered every digital password, allowing authorities to check Joanna's recent messages, phone calls, and email activity. Her phone, left undisturbed in the apartment, indicated the last outgoing call was to her father. Nothing unusual or ominous was shared. Surveillance footage from the building's entrance showed Joanna unlocking the front door at precisely 8:53 p.m. that Friday. She exchanged a brief greeting with 3B's elderly resident, entered the lobby with a small bag of groceries, and disappeared into the stairwell leading to her unit. The footage revealed nothing alarming, no one appeared to follow her, and there was no sign of a struggle. In the early hours of Monday, officers examined the back staircases and alleyways that connected the building to the street behind, hoping for any sign that Joanna might have left, willingly or otherwise. They combed nearby parks, scoured the frozen Charles River embankment, and canvassed local businesses for additional security footage. Yet every lead seemed to dissolve into the winter mist. Simultaneously, police forensic experts began processing the apartment for anything the untrained eye might have missed. Using luminol and fingerprint powder, they swept the doorways, walls, and common areas for prints that didn't match Greg's or Joanna's. They sent stray hairs for DNA analysis, searched the drains and trash for signs of struggle, and dusted for prints on the window locks and sills. Despite the meticulous work, nothing immediately suggested foul play. No forced entry, no broken glass, no blood, and no sign of a struggle. Joanna seemed to have vanished into thin air. The media caught wind of Joanna's disappearance by Monday afternoon. First it was the local Boston stations, but within a day regional and national outlets picked up the story. Phrases like Beacon Hill vanishing and Christmas mystery dominated headlines and news tickers, adding a layer of public anxiety and urgency. Police set up a tip hotline that soon flooded with calls, some offering well-intentioned but unhelpful information, others reporting supposed sightings in Boston, Cambridge, or even as far as Maine. Officers painstakingly followed up on every credible lead, but each proved fruitless. Greg became the first focus of scrutiny. The boyfriend is, statistically, often the first suspect when a woman disappears. Yet Greg's alibi was airtight. Credit card receipts, GPS logs, and family confirmation placed him in Connecticut all weekend. Forensics found no inconsistencies between his account and the physical evidence. Twice, he was interviewed at length, answering every question without hesitation, visibly devastated by Joanna's absence. Next, attention turned to other residents. Detectives questioned the building's owner, a retired English teacher named Jeffrey, who lived on the premises. They searched his apartment, checked his security camera, a personal system aimed at his door and hallway. Jeffrey's behavior raised no red flags. He surrendered his passkey logs, showing no unusual entries to Joanna's apartment. DNA samples from Jeffrey and every resident were collected for baseline comparison, though detectives reminded the family this was standard procedure. Meanwhile, the investigation branched outward. Police tried to map Joanna's social world, her closest work colleagues, friends from college, the art instructors she'd grown close to, and people she'd met at local workshops or events. They combed through emails, direct messages, social media profiles, and neighborhood security footage. Friends described Joanna as upbeat, cautious, and always reliably communicative. It simply didn't fit that she'd leave without a word, especially not at the holidays, not with her cherished pet left behind. The search also took on a physical grassroots component. Joanna's family and friends printed hundreds of flyers with her photo. A candid shot of her smiling in the Boston Public Garden, hair windblown and eyes bright. Volunteers and co-workers joined the effort, taping flyers to lampposts, park entrances, bus shelters, and coffee shop windows throughout central Boston. Social media campaigns gained momentum as local and national true crime forums, Twitter and Facebook groups buzzed with updates, theories, and pleas for tips. Joanna's parents gave interviews, their plea alternating between hopeful and heartbroken. The police continued to investigate every angle. They revisited the store where Joanna bought the pizza and cider, confirming her purchase and demeanor from the cashier, who remembered her as friendly, in a good mood, no signs of distress. They reviewed outdoor security footage but found no strangers lurking, no suspicious activity. Even so, a shadow of unease grew in the neighborhood. Doors were double-locked, windows checked obsessively, and Beacon Hill residents grew warier of unfamiliar faces. By the end of the first week, the official task force had grown. Seasoned homicide detectives partnered with missing persons specialists and forensic psychologists. They sifted through Joanna's digital footprint, noting that every aspect pointed to stability, enthusiasm, and future plans. No significant withdrawals had occurred from her bank accounts. Her credit cards were unused, there was no evidence of secret travel or a hidden crisis. The circumstantial evidence, combined with a lack of any physical or digital lead, pointed to a chilling possibility. Whatever happened to Joanna occurred suddenly, and most likely within her own apartment. The initial days of uncertainty quickly became excruciating for Joanna's loved ones, a purgatory of unanswered questions, relentless searching, and the growing realization that the safest neighborhood in Boston was not immune to inexplicable tragedy. The Beacon Hill building, which had represented a new beginning for Joanna, morphed overnight into a symbol of loss and mystery. And as the days stretched, with every avenue exhausted and every lead run dry, reality settled in. Someone, somewhere, knew more about Joanna's disappearance than they were telling. That knowledge would soon turn this missing person case into the centerpiece of one of Boston's most intense criminal investigations in memory. The investigation process. The last clues. From the moment Joanna's disappearance was confirmed, the Beacon Hill apartment transformed from a vibrant sanctuary to a nerve center of uncertainty and urgency. The Boston Police Department, confronted by a case so hauntingly devoid of straightforward answers, knew that conventional timeframes and checklists would not suffice. The following days were a masterclass in both methodical attention to detail and the raw, emotional drive fueling this search for truth, a quest shadowed by citywide anxiety and unresolved grief. The early morning after Joanna was reported missing, the official command center took shape within her very building. Investigators and forensic specialists established a base in the apartment, spreading out maps, photos, and notes, reconstructing her final hours with the focus of a chess grandmaster. The first order of business was confirming Joanna's last verified sighting. Security footage and witness statements left no doubt she entered the building just before 9 p.m., groceries in hand, cheerfully greeting neighbors. No one saw her leave. Nothing on video suggested forced entry, and her personal effects remained untouched. The absence of a clear escape or abduction route made this disappearance all the more chilling. Detectives subdivided their efforts. The apartment itself was subject to 3 successive sweeps, each time involving different forensic teams to ensure no detail went overlooked. Specialists used luminol to detect latent blood traces. None were found. Every surface, from the kitchen counters to the undersides of windowsills, was fingerprinted. If fingerprints didn't belong to Joanna or Greg, they were meticulously cataloged. Any stray hairs or fibers were gathered for DNA testing. In a city as old as Boston, evidence sometimes lingered from tenants long gone. Still, each item was treated as potentially crucial. The police made a point of inviting Joanna's parents to participate, allowing them brief moments to retrieve personal items while under forensic supervision, a small gesture of empathy within the relentless logic of an investigation. Attention then shifted to the building's layout and its many points of entry. Detectives re-examined every security camera, verifying timestamps and cross-checking them against alibis provided by other residents. The back stairwell, which emptied onto a narrow alleyway rarely traveled in winter, was inspected at dawn. Officers combed through fresh snow in search of boot prints, drag marks, or traces of a struggle, yet the snowfall had gently erased any evidence overnight. Meanwhile, more officers canvassed the neighborhood in widening concentric circles, questioning clerks, baristas, and dog walkers alike. Did anyone see Joanna between 9 p.m. and midnight? Had any strangers been observed loitering near the apartment or entering businesses at odd hours? It was through this canvassing that the investigators uncovered their first minor but potentially telling anomaly. A neighbor on the 3rd floor recalled hearing soft footsteps in a brief muffled conversation in the hallway shortly after 9:30 p.m. She couldn't place the voices and didn't find the noise alarming. Beacon Hill was a hub of comings and goings, particularly before the holidays. Still, this odd snippet, when compared to the static of an almost silent building, hinted that there might have been movement not caught on camera. Investigators chased every digital lead. With Greg's cooperation, they reconstructed Joanna's online footprint minute by minute. Texts, social media, emails, cloud storage. Nothing pointed to trouble. There was no evidence of cyberstalking, harassment, or secret complaints about threats. A batch of Christmas cards, found on her computer in draft form and in her handwriting on the kitchen table, spoke to her plans for the coming days. No one in her wide network of friends had received a farewell or odd message. The final texts exchanged were perfectly in character, cheerful, affectionate, looking forward to the holiday weekend. Out of necessity, police widened the investigation to include other residents, especially those who might have had both motive and opportunity. Each apartment was searched with consent, and residents were asked to account for their whereabouts with receipts, phone logs, and third-party confirmation. A retired school teacher, a young legal associate, and a reclusive graduate student, all submitted to interviews, DNA swabbing, and inspection of their units. The landlord, Mr. Jeffrey, was questioned about master keys and the building's security protocols. While some online attention and media whispers tried to cast suspicion his way, his records and personal schedule raised no red flags. He was eventually ruled out, but not before the press, and some frightened neighbors, had turned his life upside down. Forensic evidence, while sparse, provided small stepping stones. A partial fingerprint on Joanna's grocery bag didn't match her or Greg. It was run against the building's other residents and staff. Initial results suggested it could belong to a neighbor, but DNA swabs were needed to confirm. Simultaneously, police flagged small scratches on the rear window frame, a possible sign of tampering or hurried entry/exit. Analysis would take days, but for now, it was noted as a possible vector in or out of the apartment that had escaped initial scrutiny. As routine searches yielded no dramatic breakthroughs, the focus turned to the wider city. Checkpoints were set up at major transit hubs. Flyers with Joanna's image papered bus stops and subway entrances. Missing persons bulletins were distributed to hospitals, shelters, and clinics, on the off chance she had suffered memory loss or was hiding from an unknown threat. Each day new witnesses volunteered information, but as is often the case, many tips led to dead ends. A look-alike spotted on Commonwealth Ave, a sighting that proved to be someone else entirely. Still, the investigation pressed forward on multiple fronts, unwilling to abandon the smallest hope. It was on the fifth day, as the initial shock began to morph into grim determination, that the investigation found two developments. Forensic analysts working overtime matched the partial print from the grocery bag to a neighboring resident, Vincent T., a young Dutch engineer who had recently moved in. Vincent's alibi, previously checked by a casual phone conversation with a friend, began to unravel when timestamps and travel records failed to fully corroborate his story. At the same time, a neighboring shopkeeper came forward with previously overlooked security footage showing Vincent leaving the alley behind the apartment late that Friday night, at a time when all other building residents were accounted for. Police brought Vincent in for formal questioning. His behavior was evasive. He struggled with certain details, and his story shifted under pressure. Detectives pressed on. Was there a link to Joanna? Any recent interaction or disagreement? Vincent denied knowing her well, describing only the most casual acquaintance. A greeting here, a polite smile there. But the evidence now compelled police to treat him as a suspect, not simply another neighbor with an unfortunate overlap of fingerprints. The sense in the command center shifted palpably. Investigators, until now chasing shadows, found themselves with real lines of inquiry. A suspect whose actions and explanations no longer matched, forensic traces hinting at proximity in the crucial hours, and a community both relieved and restless at the prospect of answers finally within reach. The search for Joanna was far from over, but the case had moved from the haze of possibility into the sharp edges of criminal investigation, with the last clues finally shedding faint light in Boston's long, anxious winter nights. The media storm breaks, a landlord wrongly accused. As days and then weeks unfolded after Joanna's chilling disappearance, the quiet anguish in Beacon Hill boomeranged outward, quickly catching the attention of Boston's fast-responding news outlets. By now, the collective anxiety of neighbors and friends blended with an urgent public curiosity, as speculation blossomed into round-the-clock television reports, radio commentary, true crime podcasts, and a digital blitzwave on social media. What began as a missing person notice soon exploded into a citywide and then national saga, marked by a thirst for answers, fear-mongering headlines, and a hunt for a villain. The result? An atmosphere electrified with suspicion, grief, and a perilous rush to judgment. The media canvas was painted in bold, attention-grabbing colors. Local anchors stood near Joanna's apartment doorway filming live updates among clusters of reporters, their voices edged with a blend of empathy and barely concealed excitement. Details, some factual, many speculative, were recycled and magnified with every newscast. Information that officials hadn't confirmed, like the supposed lack of forced entry and Joanna's phone left behind, fueled rampant conjecture about who could have harmed a vibrant young woman in what residents still considered a fortress of safety. As always, the media's hunger for a culprit zeroed in on those nearest to the scene. It wasn't long before a fresh wave of suspicion settled on Jeffrey Carlisle, the longtime landlord of the Beacon Hill building, a retired English teacher in his 70s. At first, this seemed reasonable even to some neighbors. After all, Jeffrey lived alone on the premises, had access to spare keys, and was a familiar yet private figure rarely seen socializing beyond polite greetings. His presence became a convenient narrative peg for journalists whose deadlines demanded dramatic tension. A rotating cast of television crews staked out the sidewalk. Tabloids published grainy photos of Jeffrey passing mailboxes, painting him as an enigmatic recluse. Even crime pundits on primetime segments speculated, was there something off about this kindly old man's demeanor? In reality, Jeffrey's world was unraveling. His daily rituals, morning walks, tending plants on the stoop, reading at the library, were interrupted by relentless questions and unannounced visitors with cameras. Reporters pressed him for statements, sometimes ambushing him in the lobby. Anonymous online sleuths, hungry for a villain, dug into property records and gossip, finding unremarkable but suggestive clues to spin into larger accusations. On social media, public groups argued over his guilt or innocence, with some users making threats or demanding his arrest. The presumption of innocence was a distant memory. Trial by media and the digital mob now held sway. This press attention bled swiftly into the official investigation. Detectives and forensic analysts, hyper-aware of media scrutiny, worked to transparently eliminate Jeffrey from suspicion. Repeatedly, he surrendered to lengthy interviews, submitted DNA and fingerprints, allowed methodical searches of his apartment and volunteered records showing his whereabouts. His passkey log matched only mundane activity, yet for many in the court of public opinion, these reassurances failed to exonerate him. After all, the lack of evidence became, in conspiracy-laced forums, evidence that he was smart enough to hide something. The pressure on law enforcement rose alarmingly. Family and friends of Joanna, some quietly relieved the focus had shifted away from them, begged for answers while defending Jeffrey privately. A rift blossomed in the building itself. A few tenants withdrew into suspicion or fear, while others offered Jeffrey small acts of kindness in the face of local hostility. Holiday lights, once symbols of hope, now flickered against a pall of uncertainty as the Boston winter deepened. Meanwhile, the news cycle fed and mutated itself. Cable shows ran exposés on landlord crimes, and tabloid columnists questioned the safety of single women in supposedly secure buildings. On talk radio, callers demanded tighter landlord background checks and invoked unrelated national tragedies to stoke fear. Advocacy groups inserted themselves with well-meaning, if sometimes misinformed, calls to action, further fraying patience and focus. The more Jeffrey protested his innocence, the louder the speculation seemed to grow, until, inevitably, the sheer volume of rumor itself became its own reason for suspicion. At the height of this storm, Jeffrey's family, his grown children, former colleagues, and old students, rallied to his defense, providing character witnesses and speaking out on public radio. Local clergy invited him to speak at vigils, and neighbors who knew his routines vouched for his gentleness and reliability. Still, for Jeffrey, every doorbell brought dread. Shopping for groceries meant a gauntlet of hostile glances. Even when police delivered formal statements exonerating him of involvement, headlines buried these clarifications under more dramatic subplots. For Joanna's loved ones, this period was an agony of divided attention. While desperate for progress, they found themselves torn between gratitude for the media's reach, which kept the search alive and brought new tips, and horror at the relentless, unfounded suspicion grown around a man they knew as a harmless friend. The family issued careful statements pleading for calm and respect, and their appeals were sometimes drowned out by a clickbait-fueled public hunger for villainy. Eventually, the whirlwind shifted as investigators gathered hard evidence pointing elsewhere: the uncovered fingerprint, the timeline discrepancies of a neighbor, and surveillance footage that finally redirected the narrative. Ironically, media coverage was slow to correct its own excesses. For Jeffrey, the scars ran deep. Though the accusations had been found baseless, he'd lost sleep, privacy, and the trust of some in his once-cherished community. He ultimately filed suit against several outlets and social media personalities, eventually winning a public apology and a sizable settlement. If there was a lesson to be drawn from this torment, It was how quickly even well-meaning curiosity curdles into groupthink, how a rush of cameras and talking heads can so easily ruin an innocent life. And for Beacon Hill, Joanna's case became not only a signal tragedy, but also a cautionary tale about the righteousness of restraint. Truth, in the end, arrives on its own hard timetable, indifferent to the noise, the headlines, and the insatiable appetite for the next shocking twist. The turning point. Unmasking the real culprit. In the weeks following Joanna's disappearance, the investigation teetered on the edge of hopelessness. With each passing day, public scrutiny grew sharper, and the family's desperation deepened. The media had shifted its focus after the landlord's exoneration, but the investigation pressed on in silence, led by tenacious Boston detectives, forensic specialists, and the tireless search of Joanna's loved ones. By now, all standard protocols had been exhausted, every local video camera's memory combed through, every resident in the Beacon Hill building interviewed repeatedly, and all known associates cleared through airtight alibis and digital footprints. Yet no one could deny something chillingly purposeful had happened that night. The lack of evidence, as investigators well knew, did not mean the absence of a crime. It meant the work had to go deeper. Detectives pored back over the evidence, piecing together every fragment that didn't fit. Special attention was paid to the forensic anomalies identified: a partial print on Joanna's grocery bag, the scratches on the back window frame, and the slight mismatch in the timeline of the building's comings and goings. Teams mapped out the building minute by minute, creating elaborate visual timelines sprawling across whiteboards. Every seemingly trivial detail was given its due: a forgotten receipt, the direction in which a security camera was facing, the temperature of the room as noted by the responding officers. Patterns started to emerge from the fog of sorrow and confusion. One such pattern revolved around Vincent T., the reserve Dutch engineer who had lived in the adjacent unit since late autumn. Vincent had at first seemed as ordinary and invisible as any new tenant might hope to be. Punctual rent payments, polite nods to neighbors, sometimes seen with headphones and a backpack as he left for his tech job, little more. The initial wave of interviews had yielded nothing unusual, but as the investigation drilled deeper, cracks in his story began to show. Detectives returned to Vincent's apartment under the guise of routine follow-ups. There, subtle inconsistencies appeared. For one, Vincent's account of his Friday night movements grew less detailed with each retelling. He initially claimed to have spent the evening streaming movies, communicating with a friend overseas, and then turning in early. Yet his building keycard usage revealed he'd left his apartment at least twice after midnight, a fact he omitted in his statements. When pressed, Vincent grew defensive, and a faint tremor ran through his voice. Digital forensics finally caught a break. Analysis of traffic camera footage from a nearby alleyway showed a solitary figure matching Vincent's height and gait slipping out of the building's rear entrance late on the night of Joanna's disappearance. The figure carried something bundled, hurried, yet purposeful. While the image was grainy, the timestamp and Vincent's lack of a solid alibi made it impossible to ignore. Warrant in hand, investigators entered Vincent's apartment for a deeper search. The atmosphere inside was meticulous, almost clinically arranged, hardly unusual for an engineer but unsettling in context. They noticed a few items missing from earlier sweeps. A pair of winter boots had vanished, replaced by a new pair with clean soles. Drawers had been reorganized. One of Joanna's lost holiday cards, signed but never addressed, was found tucked inside a technical manual. When questioned, Vincent fumbled to explain how the card came to be in his possession, giving conflicting stories involving misplaced mail and neighborly exchanges that no one could corroborate. It was the partial fingerprint on Joanna's grocery bag, the anomaly that had languished for days in a lab queue, that finally confirmed the suspicions. DNA analysis returned a highly probable match to Vincent. Faced with forensic evidence tying him to Joanna's apartment and the night in question, Vincent's composure cracked. In a painstaking interview that stretched into the early hours, detectives patiently reconstructed the timeline once more. Presented with evidence, Vincent's answers grew evasive, then agitated. Finally, confronted with the damning forensic report and the witness account of him seen returning through the alley, Vincent's resistance withered. The confession, when it came, was halting and riddled with contradiction, yet impossible to misinterpret. Vincent admitted to entering Joanna's unit, driven by a crescendo of stress and emotional instability, brought on by an unraveling personal life and professional isolation. The encounter grew heated after a startled Joanna confronted him in the apartment. What began as a confrontation escalated into violence. Vincent, in a state of mounting panic, struck out in a clumsy, desperate act that spiraled into tragedy. He confessed to hastily concealing Joanna's body, and in a frenzied attempt to cover his tracks, transporting her through the back of the building and into the cold, pre-dawn streets. Each detail, though delivered through tears and rationalizations, fit the puzzle that investigators had labored over for weeks. The motif of the silent snow, the absence of outward struggle, and the peculiar disappearance of Pixel, the beloved cat, finally made a terrible, logical sense. Vincent, unable to leave the pet behind as a living witness, took Pixel as part of his escape, abandoning the animal far from the scene. With the admission in hand and corroborating forensic evidence, authorities rapidly located Joanna's remains in a remote, wooded area outside Greater Boston. Pixel, miraculously, was later recovered by a rescue group and identified through her microchip, a rare instance of small solace for a family shattered by the ordeal. The prosecution moved forward swiftly. Vincent, in court, seemed a husk of the withdrawn neighbor residents thought they knew. During the proceedings, the details of the case shocked the public. How proximity and misjudged normalcy could so easily masquerade as safety. The trial was brief, the evidence overwhelming. Vincent received a life sentence without possibility of parole, his confession and post-crime behavior closing the chapter on an investigation that had tormented a city and forever changed a family's course. The turning point, rooted in dogged investigation, forensic breakthroughs, and a refusal to yield to mistaken narratives, transformed Joanna's case from an inscrutable mystery into a hard-won search for truth. While the outcome could never restore what was lost, the work of countless investigators, digital analysts, and community volunteers ensured that the shadow cast by that December night would ultimately yield clarity, justice, and, perhaps in time, some measure of peace for those left behind. Resonance, lessons, and closure. The aftermath of Joanna's tragedy rippled outward in waves, quiet at first, then rising in a crescendo that lingered long after news cycles faded and the courtroom lights dimmed. For Joanna's family, the initial shock was followed by a kind of numbness that only deepened when faced with the responsibilities of grief. Arranging her memorial, sorting through her possessions, and making sense of a future abruptly deprived of her laughter and energy. The old church in Salem where she'd been baptized and later confirmed was crowded for her remembrance service. Among the mourners were not only family and friends, but colleagues, former teachers, and neighbors who hardly knew her except through the haunting headlines. People brought flowers, sketches she'd made, and candles, setting these tokens beneath her graduation photo and the last mural she'd completed as a student. Words failed, but the hush in the vaulted sanctuary spoke volumes. For weeks, Joanna's absence was felt at every turn. Her parents withdrew from the public eye as waves of media requests refused to abate. They found solace eventually in small acts, publishing her unfinished design theses alongside tributes collected from the children she'd mentored, visiting the city park she had helped design, placing a bench in her name in the community garden she once loved. Greg, her partner, left the Beacon Hill apartment within a month, the memories within those four walls too vivid to bear. He struggled to reclaim a sense of peace, eventually volunteering at an urban youth program, returning in a way to the roots that first united him and Joanna. Joanna's brother Patrick and her friends formed a foundation dedicated to women in landscape architecture, intent on turning their pain into opportunity for others. At the same time, the Beacon Hill community wrestled with a profound loss of innocence. The notion that violence could strike so invisibly inside their storied and seemingly impenetrable building left residents on edge for months. Where once there had been impromptu hallway chats and holiday cookie swaps, there was now cautious politeness and a wary reticence. Few trusted the locks on their doors or the quiet routines of their neighbors with the same confidence as before. It took years, and the arrival of new tenants, births, and celebrations, before a measure of normalcy fully returned to the building. Jeffrey Carlisle, the landlord whose life had been upended by false accusation, began the long process of repair. The legal vindication and public apologies brought some relief, as did the settlement from intrusive media outlets, but the ordeal left scars. Some friends kept their distance, hesitant and unsure. He found new purpose in advocacy for privacy and responsible journalism, working with civic groups and universities to educate future reporters on the cost of hasty, evidence-light narratives. Despite his exoneration, Jeffrey could never completely reclaim his former sense of security or community belonging. Instead, he channeled his lingering pain into teaching, volunteering, and supporting others who had been similarly harmed by rumor and conjecture. For city officials and law enforcement, the investigation became a case study, a cautionary tale discussed in detective academies and law seminars. The Boston Police Department instituted changes to how missing persons cases are triaged, and how media liaisons should communicate with the public, aiming to prevent speculation from derailing due process. Training modules highlighted the need for careful evidence gathering, community sensitivity, and the management of both traditional and social media stormfronts. Detectives who worked Joanna's case, though proud of their perseverance, admitted privately to sleepless nights, the specter of past missteps, and the weight of near misses haunting them well beyond the trial. They learned in hard terms that truth is not only a matter of forensics and confession, but also of discipline, empathy, and patience. Perhaps most significantly, Joanna's case changed Beacon Hill forever. Community meetings grew more frequent as residents debated security, emergency readiness, and mental health support. The mural Joanna had painted in the local school gymnasium was restored and rededicated, serving as both a lasting memorial and an annual rally point for a day of neighborhood service. Support groups for women living alone and communal block watch programs multiplied in the wake of her loss. Many locals, reflecting on what happened, felt compelled to extend greater kindness to neighbors, determined not to let suspicion and isolation become the legacy of tragedy. Nationally, Joanna's story entered the broader conversation about urban safety, privacy, and the responsibilities of media in the digital age. Commentators pointed to the dangers of sensationalism, the pitfalls of armchair sleuthing, and the challenges of balancing public interest with individual rights. Advocacy groups invoked Joanna's memory to argue for improvements to tenant protections, city surveillance infrastructure, and the handling of mental health crises in tight-knit communities. Scholars cited the case in debates about gender and vulnerability, examining how bright, capable women are too often failed by a system slow to recognize the warning signs that precede acts of violence. For those closest to Joanna, closure did not arrive neatly or quickly. Grief moved on its own timeline, some days sharp, some days muted and distant, always transformed by the rituals of remembrance and action. Conversations about Joanna shifted in tone over time, from horror and disbelief, to anger and advocacy, and ultimately to affectionate storytelling. Family and friends learned to celebrate not just the accomplishments she'd left behind but the principles she lived for: optimism, generosity, and the idea that a single committed person can change the texture of a community. On the first anniversary of Joanna's passing, a candlelit vigil wound its way through Beacon Hill. Neighbors, colleagues, and strangers carried lanterns and laid fresh greenery at her favorite garden, an affirmation of the beauty she had brought to the world and the hope she inspired in others. At the memorial's close, Joanna's mother stood before the gathering and offered words that would live on as the truest legacy of a life interrupted but never forgotten. May we honor Joanna not just by mourning, but by making this city a little safer, a little kinder, and a little more alive every single day. Thus, the resonance of Joanna Z's story persisted in a city transformed, not by the darkness of what happened to her, but by the lasting light of what she left behind.